Hey, well, I hope you had a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year if I don't see you. But I had a question from Jasper that says, so Jasper's asking about fear foods. Jasper says, I came to the conclusion that many of the fear foods in my past had little or nothing to do with calories, but lots to do with trauma. For example, pancakes were hard to tackle for a while because of the association it had with weekend quarrels between dad and the family, and pizza was a common weeknight meal, another moment in intense family disputes. I'm glad to say that I tackled those a good while ago, but while wondering if it's common and how common it is. I think that is a good question, actually. I hate it when people say that, oh, that's a good question, because, well, duh, obviously it's a good question, otherwise I wouldn't read it out, would I? But I do think it's a good thing to discuss, right? My opinion, honestly, is I don't think it's not as much about trauma as much as it is about when we act in a certain way around something, our brain's always watching and learning. And so if you consistently act in a way that is avoidant of pizza, the action of avoidance is one of the things that teaches our brain to be fearful. And so if you consistently avoid or go out of your way to avoid a food, then generally your brain's going to be like, wow, shit, pizza must be like pretty dangerous because my human is going out of their way to get away from eating this pizza. So better look out for that pizza. And so the action of avoidance, it's just a fear thing. It's a brain mechanism. If you avoid something consistently, then the avoidance teaches your brain to be fearful of it. So I do think, personally, that most fear foods come about because we avoid that food. And then our brain's like, oh, shit, that must be dangerous. So the other thing, I think, with me is that the word trauma rubs me up the wrong way a little bit because it's so overused. And this is where therapists will be like, this is blasphemy. But I think of trauma as something like really awful happening, really traumatic happening. And while I could say that my mum pushing me to eat an egg mayonnaise sandwich when I didn't want one felt traumatic, I still am not, I just personally can't trust that. I can't chalk that down and call it a traumatic experience. I just can't do it. I'm like, it just does not, to me, saying that mum pushing me to eat an egg mayonnaise sandwich when I had anorexia was traumatic just feels like really disrespectful for everybody that lived through World War One and Two. So I'm not going to do that. I just can't do it. But just because I can't do it does not mean that there's not something in what Jasper's saying there. That the brain has associated having family meals that involve pizza with uncomfortable, anxiety-provoking, and not pleasant experiences. Let's call it that. Let's not call it trauma. Let's just call it unpleasant. It's unpleasant, fucking unpleasant, to be forced to eat pizza when you have an eating disorder, and fucking unpleasant to be forced to eat an egg mayonnaise sandwich when you have an eating disorder. But not trauma. Anyway, so now we've got those sort of definitions. If we can not define what Jasper's saying as trauma, I can absolutely agree with it. If we can say what Jasper's saying is that the brain has had so many similar experiences of sitting down with the family and pizza being present and it causing massive feelings of anxiety and upset and all of those things, we can say that Jasper's brain would have learned along the while to maybe associate pizza with that sort of unpleasant anxiety and therefore want to be like, well, obviously pizza is the common denominator here and obviously it's the pizza that's the problem. So however it doesn't really matter, honestly, though, how we define any of this. The main thing about overcoming these fear foods is recognizing it. Like, you can dig into it and be like, well, why is it that my brain really has a problem with tuna sandwiches? And you can dig into it and you can maybe draw conclusions that are sort of like, oh, well, it must be those picnics that I was forced to go on when I had an eating disorder. And always tuna sandwiches being present. It's picnics. That's why my brain is upset with picnics and tuna sandwiches. And that is why my brain has a problem with tuna sandwiches right now. Like, you can do all that, but honestly, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter why your brain has a problem with tuna sandwiches. You still have to overcome it. You still have to rewire that. You still have to teach your brain not to fear tuna sandwiches. And the way that we do that, the method that we do that, is exactly the same, regardless of whether your brain dislikes tuna sandwiches because you were forced to eat them on picnics, or your brain dislikes tuna sandwiches because it feels bad for the tuna, or your brain dislikes tuna sandwiches just because you avoided tuna sandwiches for so long. It doesn't matter. The way that we do of it is exactly the same. And guess what that is? You've got to eat the fucking tuna sandwiches. And you've got to eat tuna sandwiches until you no longer have a problem with tuna sandwiches. So we don't really have to explore or worry about too much why these fear foods come about. We just need to understand that the way to deal with them is by eating them. It can be interesting to think about it, but sometimes I just think people get a bit lost doing that, especially, I blame the therapists again, but you can spend a whole session in therapy exploring why you don't like pizza, whereas honestly, the best thing to do would have been not to even worry about why you don't like pizza, but just to say, well, pizza's a problem, so off we go, let's go and eat some pizza. That would have been better use of the session, if you ask me, which is, ladies and gentlemen, why I am not a therapist.